Artem Frankov, former FC Lviv player who died in the fighting around Kharkiv on April 22nd, 2022. Oleksandr Popovchenko, former Sumy Frunzenets player who was killed during a border patrol in his province in May 16. Oleksandr Shishkov, Oleg Mazur, he played for Rudno. Sergei Balanchuk, a former Dynamo Kyiv, Yuri Sarik, Dmitro Fialkov, Ruslan Kurdas, Mikola Zhidkov, Petro Gavrilov, Sergei Rozov, a former Dynamo player, Malakov, a player for Cherkasy Dnipro, was killed while assaulting a position in June of 2023. He was 21 years old. Football in Ukraine will never be the same. The players, the coaches, the mentors have died and are still dying. But the Ukrainian league carries on. It's going on right now, impossibly producing a full domestic season and clubs that can even compete in European competitions at a high level. That is the story we are here to tell. And we teamed up with a researcher who speaks the languages of the region to help us tell it. For our research partner, Yacov, we dedicate this video to the late great Ukrainian football writer Artem Frankov, his mentor and friend. In Ukraine, the football league has to continue. For so long, Ukrainian identity was tied up in football that Ukrainian nationalism, war, and football, they're all rolled up into one. This is because football in Ukraine took shape when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, one of just 15 different Soviet republics. This meant that football was one of the fewer stages where Ukraine could maintain its own identity and separate itself from those other republics. This was difficult because the clubs in the Soviet era were technically amateur, which meant that the clubs concentrated around centers of power, where those in power could funnel different political favors and resources towards their favorite clubs. We uncovered documents from the 60s that showed even though there were technically strict budget rules in place, clubs would often spend twice that budget as long as they had a powerful government benefactor to back them up on it. This would obviously provide these select clubs, particularly in Moscow, with a huge advantage. But Ukraine eventually got its own benefactor, a guy named Vladimir Sherbetsky. He was the chairman of the Council of Ministers of the Ukrainian Republic, which essentially meant he had become one of those power brokers, and he became determined to concentrate footballing power in Kyiv. But the problem, as I'd already detailed, was that all of that footballing power was concentrated in Moscow up until 1953. There was also Dynamo Tbilisi in Georgia. They were doing very well because Joseph Stalin's right-hand man Lavrentiy Beria was running the secret police around there and loved that club. But when Stalin died in 1953, Ukraine took its first step to making football its national identity. And Sherbetsky took a very aggressive step towards recruiting players from all around Ukraine and concentrating them in Kyiv. And this was aided by the next leader, who became Nikita Khrushchev, who had spent time in the Ukrainian government before ascending to power. His soft spot for Ukraine meant that Ukrainian teams could finally start to recruit aggressively around Ukraine, even reaching into other republics, coming into conflict with some of the Moscow teams. And after all, that was Sherbetsky's goal, because like many other Ukrainians, he was completely obsessed with football. In an amazing 2008 interview with his wife, she said that she only saw Sherbetsky cry 3 times, after a mine explosion killed dozens of people, after Chernobyl, and after he watched Dynamo Kyiv upset the reigning European champions Bayern Munich in the European Super Cup. And that kind of passion mixed with political power in an allegedly amateur system was a boon. Sherbetsky was able to get apartments, he was able to get rare consumer goods for players that decided that they wanted to play in Kyiv outside of just subsidizing the club's budget to begin with. But in a very unusual move for the time in the Soviet Union, he also let the people he hired do their job. The coaches, the managers, they could make their own decisions free of his influence, and that combination with his incredible pulling power for players turned Dynamo Kyiv into a serious force. By 1961, they'd caught up. Dynamo Kyiv won the Russian championship for the first time, and Ukrainian players were starting to push Russian ones out of the Soviet national team. That means those great Soviet teams of the 60s and the 70s that kept popping up at World Cups and Euros had a lot of Ukrainians in them. That was a big point of pride for Ukrainian heritage and history. I mean, in the 1970s, Dynamo Kyiv itself was used as the Soviet national team on multiple occasions. They just took the club and made it the national team for a few matches. And it also wasn't just Dynamo Kyiv. The rising tide in Ukrainian football produced a couple of other big clubs. Dnipro, Shakhtar, who you might recognize, and Zorya, all elevated to the top level of the Soviet game. Now, want to be clear, they could never catch Dynamo, though. None of them ever actually won a Soviet championship because their best players just somehow always ended up on Sherbetsky's Dynamo Kyiv. It's all those rare consumer goods and apartments. Honestly, I could probably be bribed with the same thing. And as a result, despite a late start, Dynamo Kyiv would finish the Soviet era with 13 titles. That's more than any other club, including all of the clubs in Moscow. Dynamo Kyiv was the best team in the Soviet era domestically. And in 1991, that era abruptly ended, and a lot of Soviet clubs crashed and burned trying to transition from an amateur model to a professional one. But football was so strong in the newly independent Ukraine, they were able to get a league up and running, and a new team quickly ascended to the top with a bold new strategy. That was Shakhtar Donetsk. That strategy was to sign undervalued South American talents and then resell them for a huge profit, which allowed Shakhtar Donetsk to just make a lot more money than the other clubs in the early going. Willian, Fernandinho, Douglas Costa, that's just the beginning of a list of players that were sold to help balance Shakhtar Donetsk during the transition. Now, don't get me wrong, Dynamo Kyiv continued to win a lot of domestic titles, but it was Shakhtar Donetsk that officially announced the transition from amateur to professional was over, because in 2009, Shakhtar won the UEFA Cup, which would eventually become the Europa League. It won a major European competition. And to provide further evidence that Ukraine was producing very good clubs once again, Shakhtar had to beat Dynamo Kyiv in the semi-final of that tournament to go on and win the whole thing. Ukraine then hosted the Euros in 2012, and even though the preparations were fraught with corruption inside the FA, so much so that UEFA threatened to pull the tournament, it did eventually go off without a hitch. And by the early 2010s, the Ukrainian league had actually caught up to the Portuguese league in European coefficients, but the good times would not last. In 2014, just 23 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, a new conflict with Russia began, and it began in the backyard of Ukraine's new best team. You might have started this video knowing who Shakhtar Donetsk was, but what you might not know is that Shakhtar has not played a true home match since 2014. That's because Shakhtar is located here, in an area that was occupied by Russian separatist forces in 2014. Their ultra-modern stadium, the Donbass Arena, where frickin' Spain beat Portugal on penalties at the 2012 Euros, was bombed out of use. Shakhtar moved its matches to Lviv, then Kharkiv, then Kyiv, a homeless club that had won a European trophy just 5 years earlier. It's also worth mentioning that Crimea was occupied by Russia in 2014. That's something that knocked two different clubs out of the top flight of the Ukrainian league because they were now technically in Russia. That included Tavria Simferopol, which is the only team to have won an independent Ukrainian league outside of Dynamo Kyiv and Shakhtar Donetsk. They joined FC Sevastopol in going to something called the Crimean League. That's because the clubs operate in what is essentially an international gray area. UEFA won't even allow them to play in the Russian league if they even wanted to, which means multiple clubs were essentially erased from existence. On the surface, the rest of the Ukrainian league continued as normal, but 2014 was very important because it brought back the idea that Ukrainian football was essential to national identity, especially in times of conquest. After all, for so long, it was what Ukraine could point at to differentiate itself from Moscow, even when it was in the same state. Vladislav Ovcharenko was a professional footballer, and in 2014, his city was overrun by separatists, and then he was thrown in jail for burning one of their flags. He was freed 15 months later in a prisoner exchange, and then he spoke to the BBC in this article. Football unites Ukrainians across the country, from separatist-held Luhansk to the western Ukrainian city of Uzhhorod. He reported that 7 years later, in 2021, when Ukraine was at the European Championships, the locals in separatist-held areas were celebrating the national team's run to the knockout stages despite authorities controlling most public groups. TVs were set up in train stations, bars and restaurants were packed, and Ukraine healed collectively through football. Even the jersey for Euro 2020 was a rallying cry for Ukrainian identity, featuring the slogan, "Glory to the Heroes," a patriotic cry in the struggle with Russia. UEFA eventually asked Ukraine to remove the slogan. But despite 2014, Ukraine's league actually rebounded spectacularly. Famed manager Roberto De Zerbi, who now manages in the Premier League at Brighton, was building a new superpower at Shakhtar Donetsk, including players like David Neres and Mihailo Mudryk. But then it happened. February 24th, 2022, and the tanks rolled into Ukraine. The season, which was in full swing, was immediately suspended as Ukraine was thrown into a fight for its very survival. Players and coaches went to the front lines, and as you heard, some of them did not come home. Just 18 of 30 matches had been played, but they still awarded places in the table for European qualification purposes, which in itself was an optimistic move. It meant they believed at some point the Ukrainian league would come back. This didn't mean that the clubs were idle, though. Shakhtar Donetsk and Dynamo Kyiv went on long international tours in 2022 to raise money for the war effort. They invited players from other Ukrainian clubs that weren't on tour to join them, and they played big opponents like Everton and Galatasaray and Roma, sometimes raising over 500,000 euros in a single match. The money was sent to refugees and children who had lost parents in the fighting. The clubs were traveling the world carrying the Ukrainian flag as a galvanizing force. The tour also helped keep the players sharp for another important challenge. Despite the lack of league time and the incredible trauma of an active war that your family and colleagues are fighting in, Ukraine still almost managed to qualify for the 2022 World Cup just a few months later. Ukraine beat Scotland in the playoff semi-final before losing very narrowly to Wales in the decisive match. But it wasn't all a brave face and a show of resilience, as understandably, the foreigners that had eventually come back after 2014 were leaving again in droves. And there was a reason for that really kneecapped the entire league structure. FIFA came in and canceled all player and staff contracts for everybody in Russia and Ukraine, which allowed anybody to leave anytime they wanted to for no fee at all. While completely understandable for a team like Shakhtar, it was a massive loss of investment and value. Their general director, Sergei Palkin, said that they lost about 50 million euros with just 4 players leaving. The extent of the economic impact on the league has yet to become clear, but what is clear is that it absolutely destroyed one of the best ways the Ukrainian league was able to make money and sustain itself: player sales. But nothing could stop the football. August of 2022, 6 months after the start of the war, the Ukrainian league started up again, right on schedule. In all of our research, there was no economic imperative to this, no war incentive to having a league going on in the middle of a war. It comes down to the importance of the sport to Ukrainians and its ability to unify people and lift the mood in a time when that is desperately needed. Undoubtedly, it is also a political tool to show that Ukraine is still functional, still here. But there were some massive logistical challenges to figure out before the league could actually play. For example, European matches could not be played in Ukraine because of the danger to other teams. So Ukraine found a way to play their home European matches in Poland, and they also played a few of them in Germany as well, traveling that distance the safest way they could figure out. And we're talking about significant distances here. Kyiv to Hamburg, where Shakhtar Donetsk played some home games, is 1,600 kilometers one way. Then you have to get back for the weekend to play a league match. The danger was so obvious and great that discussions were had about playing the entire league in exile in another country, but that idea was quickly squashed. The league would play in Ukraine. And there was another issue. 2 clubs had had their facilities completely destroyed in the fighting and could not take part in the league. The UFA's solution was that both Mariupol and Desna would be able to rejoin the top flight of Ukraine whenever they were able to. They initially said for the next year, but of course the fighting has continued, and Mariupol and Desna have not yet returned. 2 other teams were called up to replace them, and the league began play in empty stadiums with a full slate of matches. Of course, the stadiums had to be empty because it was too dangerous to gather a lot of people with the Russian missiles. The league also had to prepare a set of rules for what to do when a bomb siren is heard. When the bomb siren goes off, the teams leave the field and take cover until the bomb siren ends, and then they return and keep playing. With the frequency of bomb sirens in Ukraine, especially in certain parts of the country, that means matches can take a ridiculously long time to finish. In a recent tilt in Dnipro in eastern Ukraine between Dnipro 1 and Alexandria, the match kicked off at 5:15, but it didn't finish until 10 p.m. because of 3 different Russian air attacks. And that's not even the only match that has lasted over 4 hours. That's over half the total match time spent hiding because of a bomb siren. And the air raid sirens and the empty seats aren't the only reminder of what's going on. The 2 biggest clubs, Dynamo Kyiv and Shakhtar Donetsk, both have players who have lost brothers fighting on the front line. And these players have to carry these burdens alone, with their families often living far away in the west of the country or in a different different country entirely for their safety. Sergei Palkin, the director of Shakhtar, who we met earlier, described the situation. It's difficult from a psychological point of view. It's unbelievably hard to survive and to stay there and to live through all these moments of life. But incredibly, it was out of this situation, out of this club, that Mihailo Mudryk emerged. The Ukrainian winger became an overnight sensation with his massive transfer to Chelsea in the English Premier League for 70 million euros, which is an unbelievably large leap for a player who was just playing matches in empty stadiums with bomb sirens. 25 million euros of that transfer went to Ukrainian war victims, and the rest helped the struggling league stay financially viable. After all, there's no ticket sales. The following European campaign, after Mudryk's departure, with Shakhtar still playing its home games in Poland and Germany, they still managed an impossible feat. It beat RB Leipzig from Germany, drew mighty Real Madrid, and beat Celtic from Scotland to finish third in its Champions League group, good enough for a berth in the Europa League knockouts. And Shakhtar drew the first match of this knockout tie 2-2 in Hamburg before losing 3-1 at Marseille against their French opposition. But this year, Shakhtar, despite its amazing European run, is not the only team capturing stunning headlines out of Ukraine. The other big surprise is actually one of those two clubs that came up into the top league to replace the two clubs that could not play. It's called Krivbas, a Phoenix club that replaced one that went bust in 2013 after its oligarch owner decided to pull out. And who brought it back? Well, you might not guess it on the first try, but it was the president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky. It was his boyhood club, and in the mold of Vladimir Sherbitsky from way back in the day, Zelensky used his political clout and connections to help revive the club as a professional outfit in 2020. It was, on paper, part of an effort to help commercially revitalize some of Ukraine's overlooked cities, but Zelensky himself was admittedly a huge fan. He even took the symbolic first kick at their first match back. And at the start of the war, the club took on a whole new meaning, because their head coach became the only head coach with Ukrainian military experience. His name is Yuri Vernadub, and he was the coach at Sheriff Tiraspol in Moldova. Yes, that Sheriff Tiraspol that stunned Real Madrid in the Champions League a few years ago. Vernadub was the coach, but when the war started, he rushed to volunteer and ended up assigned to an artillery battalion. Initially, I left for Ukraine to pick up my family and return to Tiraspol, but after seeing how many people were defending their homeland, I decided to become a volunteer. I do everything that is assigned. I deliver, prepare, quite hard work. From morning to evening, we work to ensure that our guys send ready-made gifts to the enemies. Krivbas hired him off the front line to coach the team, and the club now sits top of the entire league after 18 matches. I remind you, only 3 clubs have ever won the Ukrainian league since the fall of the Soviet Union, and Krivbas is definitely not one of them. And one of those 3 obviously won it last year. It was Shakhtar that won the first season in the wartime league. But right now, Krivbas is still 5 points ahead of them. But to be fair, Shakhtar has 2 matches in hand and could have caught up by the time this video is out. But there's only 12 matches left, and Krivbas is on the cusp of doing something really special. And of particular interest, while the squad is mostly Ukrainian, like most of the league, there are actually foreign players on Krivbas. They even managed to make a new signing this past summer, while in the middle of a war. I know it sounds impossible, but they signed Croatian player Hrvoje Ilić, who played his youth football at Pescara in Italy. He joined the club this summer. He lives in Moldova now and has a taxi man specifically assigned to pick him up and drive him to each individual match for his safety. And one day he noticed that the taxi man was getting tired with all that driving, and he offered to step in and help. So even though it was for his own safety, Ilić now does some of the driving himself. Anything to get to the Krivbas match. The Ukrainian national team has also somehow managed to continue its hot streak during the war, equaling Italy on points in European Championship qualifying and being sent to the playoff against Bosnia and Herzegovina, Israel, and Iceland for a final spot in the championships this summer. And of course, the Ukrainian flag is ever present at each one of those international matches. Ukraine endures. It's the second season of Ukraine's wartime league, a situation impossible to imagine for most of their opponents on the European stage. Bomb sirens, and yet they still play. No families, and yet they still play. Empty stadiums, no money, and yet they still play. Life and death, and yet they still play. Shakhtar midfielder Taras Stepanenko said, "Sometimes you feel sad. Sometimes you feel desperate. Sometimes you don't understand why it's happening in your own country. You just have to get used to it and be strong." Ukraine endures. A huge thank you to Yacov, my research partner, without whom this video would have been impossible. His academic connections unearthed things that were just amazing, a lot of which that we couldn't even include in this video. If you want to read about it, all of our sources are down in the description. If you use Google Chrome, you can use the translate feature to try and read them. Yacov was brilliant and was able to translate them for us, which also helped us in the production of this video. If you enjoyed it, please do subscribe so that we can make more stuff like this for you all in the future. And if you want to keep watching videos, something perhaps a bit more lighthearted, then I do recommend that one. We went to the Faroe Islands and we went to the club that's the smallest club in European competition to find out how they were doing it. Spent a week there. I ate dried sheep. It was all in all a good time, but it was cold. Thank you guys for watching.